What if the next war does not begin with explosions you can see, but with the systems you trust quietly starting to drift? Your map is slightly wrong. Your flight is suddenly rerouted. Your delivery is delayed without explanation. Nothing looks broken, but something is no longer working the way it should. This is not hypothetical. Over the last 2 years, commercial aircraft over parts of Eastern Europe and the Middle East have reported GPS interference. Ships in major maritime corridors have appeared on tracking systems in places they never physically reached. These were not random glitches. They were early warnings that conflict was beginning to reach something deeper than buildings, vehicles, or soldiers. It was beginning to reach the invisible systems behind movement, coordination, and trust. Because something invisible has entered the battlefield, the systems that modern life depends on. These systems quietly support military movement, economic coordination, and civilian life. And when they are disrupted, the damage is not always visible. One of the clearest demonstrations of this shift appeared in Ukraine, where the conflict was not only over territory, but over signals, navigation, and electronic control. GPS signals were jammed, meaning they were blocked, so systems could no longer receive them. When that happens, drones lose direction, guided systems lose accuracy, and communication begins to break down. But something more dangerous was happening alongside this. Instead of simply blocking signals, they were also being manipulated. This is known as GPS spoofing. Instead of removing the signal, a false one is introduced. The system continues to operate, but on incorrect information. To understand this simply, imagine your navigation system showing that you are in London when you are actually in Manchester. You trust it, you follow it, and you end up completely lost. Now imagine that same distortion on a battlefield. A drone moves toward the wrong location. A missile follows coordinates that are slightly wrong. A unit advances based on a digital map that no longer matches the ground. The system appears to be functioning, but it is acting on false inputs. This is why spoofing is more dangerous than jamming. Jamming creates confusion because the system stops working. Spoofing creates false confidence because the system appears to work normally while operating on a false reality. Now, imagine this situation more clearly. 2 countries are in conflict. The attacking country does not immediately hit buildings or military bases. Instead, it targets the systems the other country depends on to operate. One of the most important of those systems is GPS. GPS works through satellites in space, sending signals down to Earth. A phone, a drone, an aircraft, or a missile receives that signal and calculates where it is. But there is a weakness built into the system. By the time the signal reaches the ground, it is very weak. And that creates an opening. The attacker can transmit a stronger false signal from nearby. The receiver accepts it. The system is not physically broken. It is being tricked. That is where the danger begins. The system now has the wrong location. And once the location is wrong, everything that depends on that location begins to go wrong as well. A drone thinks it is flying straight because its system tells it where it is. But that where is false. So even if it follows the path perfectly, it slowly moves in the wrong direction. A missile thinks it is aiming correctly because it trusts the coordinates it receives. But the coordinates are slightly incorrect. So the missile does exactly what it is told, but still arrives at the wrong point. Soldiers trust the screens in front of them, but the map is built on distorted signal data. So what they see no longer matches the real situation on the ground. And when that happens, even advanced systems start creating dangerous mistakes. If the location is wrong, everything that follows becomes wrong. That is what Ukraine revealed so clearly. Control of the battlefield was no longer only about weapons, numbers, or firepower. It was increasingly about who could control the signal. And once that principle became visible on the battlefield, it was only a matter of time before it spread beyond war itself. Once this kind of conflict begins, it does not stay inside the war zone. It spreads outward, first into the systems that support movement and coordination, and then into civilian life. Airspace is one of the first places where this becomes visible. Flights begin to change routes, not necessarily because of weather or mechanical faults, but because pilots depend on navigation systems. If those systems are not fully reliable, they cannot take the risk. This has already happened in parts of Europe and the Middle East, where pilots reported GPS instability. Not always total failure, but enough uncertainty to force route changes, delays, and adjustments. The same thing happens at sea, and sometimes it looks even stranger. Ships depend on GPS and maritime tracking systems to know where they are and to show others where they are. If that signal is manipulated, the ship's location becomes wrong on digital tracking systems. In one major case in the Gulf region, more than 1,000 ships showed abnormal positions. Some appeared on land. Some appeared inside airports. Not because they had physically moved, but because the signal surrounding them had changed. This matters because the attacking country is no longer only targeting the army. It is targeting the systems that control movement and coordination. That means navigation, which tells systems where things are. Timing, which tells systems when things happen. Communication, which connects systems together. And beneath all of that, it means trust. Because once people stop trusting the data, everything built on that data becomes harder to manage. The next phase of this shift became especially visible during the Israel-Gaza conflict. Israel itself confirmed periods of GPS disruption to reduce the accuracy of incoming threats. But the effects did not stay military. They spilled into civilian systems. In late 2023 and into 2024, people across Israel and parts of Lebanon reported strange location behavior. Navigation apps placed users in completely different places, sometimes even across borders. At the same time, maritime tracking systems in the eastern Mediterranean showed vessels in impossible positions, including inland areas and near airports. This is what makes modern signal warfare different. The system continues to display information. The screen still looks normal, but the underlying reality is no longer accurate. This pattern intensified further in 2026, especially in the Gulf region after rising tensions involving Iran. Large numbers of ships began reporting abnormal GPS behavior. Their positions no longer matched physical reality. Some appeared on land. Others appeared far from their actual routes. This is often described as AIS spoofing, where maritime tracking systems begin displaying false positioning data. The ships themselves had not suddenly moved. The information surrounding them had been distorted. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical energy corridors in the world. The significance becomes even clearer when you consider the location. A significant share of global oil passes through that narrow route every day. If navigation in such a region becomes unreliable, the impact is immediate. Ships slow down, routes become uncertain, insurance risks rise, and costs begin to increase. But the real impact does not stay in the Gulf. It moves outward into fuel prices, supply chains, and global markets. A signal disruption becomes an economic event, and this pattern is not confined to one region. That is why this is no longer just a military story. It is a structural story about how modern life works and what happens when the systems underneath it begin to drift. To understand why this matters so much, we need to look deeper into what GPS actually represents. Most people think of GPS as a navigation tool, something that helps you find directions. But it does much more than that. It helps systems know where they are going, and when to act. That last part matters more than most people realize. Banks use timing signals to process payments in the correct order. Phone networks use them to stay synchronized. Power grids use them to keep electricity flowing properly. So if GPS timing becomes unstable, systems do not fail all at once. They slowly drift out of sync. Small mistakes build up. Coordination gets weaker. Things become less efficient. That is why GPS is not just a convenience. It is part of the hidden backbone of modern life. And this is also changing what power means. In the past, stronger countries usually had more soldiers, more weapons, and more resources. That still matters. But now, a small disruption can create a very large effect. A cheap signal attack can affect systems worth billions. That means a smaller actor can challenge a much larger one by targeting what it depends on rather than what it owns. This is the logic of asymmetric warfare. The attacker does not need to match strength directly. They only need to identify dependence and exploit it. So what does a country do about this? The first rule is simple. Do not depend on just one system. Because if everything depends on GPS and GPS begins giving wrong information, then everything begins to go wrong together. So serious states prepare backups. We already see this in aviation. Aircraft do not depend only on GPS. Pilots are trained to use other instruments and procedures to understand where they are. Aircraft also have internal navigation systems that estimate movement based on speed and direction. Air traffic control adds another layer of guidance from the ground. The goal is not to assume perfect conditions. The goal is to remain functional when conditions are imperfect. The same principle now applies to the military. Recent wars have shown one harsh lesson very clearly. If your systems depend too much on one signal, the enemy will attack that signal first. So militaries increasingly avoid depending on only one source of information. They use multiple systems at the same time. If one gives incorrect data, they cross-check it against another. They also train to operate without GPS. So even if signals are disturbed, they can still move, communicate, and act. They also build stronger systems. Systems that are harder to disturb, and systems that can quickly detect when something is wrong. Think of it like this. Earlier, everything depended on one road. Now, countries are trying to build many roads. So even if one is blocked, movement continues. Because in this kind of war, the biggest danger is not complete failure. It is confusion. That is what real strength looks like today. Now bring this closer to home. Imagine this reaching your city. You open your map, but it is not fully reliable. You call a taxi, but the driver cannot find your exact location. You order something online, but delivery is delayed without a clear reason. Emergency services face problems because location data is slightly inaccurate. Banks and payment systems begin to stutter because timing signals are unstable. Flights are delayed, traffic becomes less efficient. Trade slows down. Nothing collapses suddenly. That is what makes it dangerous. Everything is still working, but not perfectly. And slowly, that creates pressure everywhere. This is the real meaning of modern war. Ukraine showed this in war. Israel-Gaza showed how civilians can feel it. The Gulf showed how it can affect trade and the global economy. This is not one isolated problem. It is a bigger structural shift, and that leads to one final realization. In the modern world, power is not only about physical strength. It is also about protecting and controlling the systems that everything else depends on. Because when those systems work, life feels normal. But when they are disrupted, even a little, everything starts to change. And that is the nature of the invisible war. Because today, whoever controls the signal can shape far more than the battlefield. Thank you for watching. Beyond identities, beyond borders, beyond divisions, our destiny is one. You are watching Next Horizon Global,